Welcome. Thank you so much for having me at Culturati this year. It's a really delight to be here. My name is Jen Porter. I'm with the organization Mindshare Partners. Mindshare Partners is a nonprofit that's working on the culture of workplace mental health, trying to change that culture so that both employees and the organizations that they work for can thrive. We do that in a couple ways. One is workplace training and strategic advising directly with companies. So a lot of the examples and case studies that I'm going to talk about today come from that work. As a nonprofit, we also do other work in the space to push forward the movement of workplace mental health. So we host professional communities, for example, mental health ERGs, and groups like that. We also put out a bunch of research articles, resources, things like that into the world to push forward the movement of workplace mental health. So very excited to be here and to talk about that today. Several years ago, I spoke at the CHRO at a professional services firm. And when I brought up the topic of mental health at his company, he said something like, "Oh, that's not a problem here. No one's ever mentioned mental health to me. Not really something that we need to address." What this leader didn't know is that in a regular year, 60% of people will experience symptoms of poor mental health at work. As leaders, you're the first people to understand that you can't fix a problem you can't see. If there's any sort of silver lining to the pandemic, it's that it's forcibly uncovered what really was already there. That mental health impacts every team, every conference call, every meeting, whether we decide to acknowledge it or not. If you're joining this session today, if you've been in a workplace for the last 12 months, I'm going to assume you already know that almost 80% of people say their mental health has been impacted by the pandemic. I'm going to assume you might know that there's a massive difference between the level of support that company leadership thinks they're offering in mental health and the level of support employees feel that they're actually getting. And I'm going to assume that you understand mental health is a diversity, equity, and inclusion issue. And that's been even more stark with the uprise in violence against Asian communities and the ongoing racial justice reckoning. So let's jump in to what we as leaders and managers can do about it. The good news is that workplace, and in particular leaders, are uniquely positioned to do something about the prevalence and the stigma of mental health. By do something about it, I don't mean eliminate it. Mental health is health. It's here to stay. Rather, our goals as leaders should be to support it, manage it, and ultimately become better because of it. Several years ago, I experienced a period of extreme burnout at work. It was a mix of being pregnant, having some significant setbacks in my workplace, left me feeling depressed, only partly functional. I didn't have the energy to do what I normally could. I didn't enjoy it. I wasn't engaged. However, at the time, it didn't even occur to me to tell anyone at work what I was experiencing. I was just trying to cover it up and be a strong leader and a strong professional in the workplace. But looking back, I really should have said something. My team, no doubt, was also struggling. It was a difficult time for everyone. And it would have been better to have a leader validate what people were experiencing rather than pretend that it somehow wasn't affecting me. It would have been better for the organization, the board, investors, peers who could have supported me in the organization better during that time. Now, on the other side of it, I can see what I lost by not talking about it. I can also see what I gained by going through it. For instance, I know how to recognize signs of burnout early on. I know what I can handle and what I can't. I'm more strategic about the projects that I pick, how I engage in them, and I'm certainly more empathetic to others. I know that for me, I want to work with people who have managed and overcome mental health challenges because they are better for it. They're strategic, self-aware, empathetic. They've learned to communicate clearly, advocate for themselves. These are the people and the leaders that you want on your team. But in order for us to unlock those outcomes and create that culture, mental health needs to be supported. So it's our job as leaders to create an environment that supports mental health and actually turns it into a strength. So let's start with what doesn't work. Hosting a one-time webinar. It's a logical solution to host a webinar. You know mental health is an issue. Great, let's put something on the calendar. But if this is the only thing that you've said about mental health, it's probably going to backfire. people have trust issues when it comes to mental health. In fact, 8 in 10 workers say that they won't seek help for mental health because of fear or shame. Hosting a one-time conversation about mental health and then never talking about it again can actually decrease trust because someone said, okay, I can tell this really isn't a place that prioritizes mental health. Second, telling people to take care of yourselves. This is the number one thing I've heard from leaders that they've said, from employees that they've heard, that they've been given permission somehow to take care of themselves. But you can't tell people to take care of themselves and not actually make any space for them to do it. People are working on average an extra 2 hours a day since the pandemic hit. Their home responsibilities have probably increased 2-fold or 3-fold. They need more than you telling them to take care of themselves in order to be able to do it. And finally, delegating full ownership of mental health to HR. Mental health is not a benefit. I can say that over and over. Mental health is not a benefit. It's a core responsibility of leadership. It's part of an organization's culture. Furthermore, research shows that people actually don't trust HR. If you're an HR person, you're doing a great job, and you're an important part of what mental health looks like at companies, but it can't be solely in the hands of HR. It can't be the only people talking about it. If you put mental health, which is a stigmatized topic, solely in the hands of an HR department, you won't get that traction you need to actually unlock the outcomes you can get by having a mentally healthy culture. So here's what will work. Sharing your story, being vulnerable, starting the conversation. Actually changing the way that you work and building that into your culture. And doing all this as part of a broader mental health strategy. So this is where we're going to spend the rest of our time today, including some specific case examples of what this might look like in practice. Leading with vulnerability is one of the most powerful ways to normalize mental health at your company. And research backs this up. Storytelling works. I've seen storytelling work for an executive at a semiconductor company who talked about his depression in a regular department-wide meeting and encouraged people to seek help if they needed it. Afterward, he received several emails from people who could relate to his experience, who had a similar experience, and maybe had never said anything about it before. As a leader or a manager, you want to help people understand that they aren't alone, because they aren't. Mental health affects every meeting, every call, every team. If someone doesn't understand that, they're more likely to have the burden of trying to cover it up. They're less likely to seek support. You want people seeking support. I've seen storytelling work for the head of a department who had been open about his team, about his mental health experiences as a teen, but then also about the difficulty of raising a child who was having some mental health challenges as well. So when there was an employee that worked for him who was also having some mental health challenges in his family, they could, without fear, to find support, to find someone to speak with. As a leader, you want people to reach out for support when they need it. In fact, the average time for when somebody starts to feel symptoms of a mental health challenge or mental health condition and actually seek support for it is 8 to 10 years. 8 to 10 years. If you had a friend who had the flu for 8 years, you would kick them to the doctor. But for mental health, that's the average. As leaders and managers, we don't want people working for us who've had symptoms of something for 8 years. We want them to seek support and get help. So by storytelling, lowers the barriers to seeking support for mental health. You want to talk openly about mental health, even if you feel like you haven't had an experience that maybe you would define as mental health. I guarantee you've had. If you've had extreme stress, if you've ever experienced burnout, if you've been a caregiver of somebody who's experienced mental health challenges, or if you've just been a peer, these are all mental health stories. And if you lead with them, they can be a powerful change agent. So next, I want to actually listen to a story by Lenny Mendoza. And as you're listening, think about the impact of his vulnerability for the people who worked for him. Gratitude to him for us being able to share his story. Also apologies since this is not read by him and actually a voice actor. But let's listen to his story.
Far too often, people suffer these mental health conditions with shame and without support. It has never been more urgent for business and economic leaders to move beyond platitudes on mental health. Leaders must ensure people can find vital care and acceptance for mental health challenges without punitive professional or personal impact. After I received a diagnosis of severe depression and anxiety against medical advice, I drove right back into coronavirus response. The crisis was all-consuming, and my local businesses and family also needed attention. At the time, I told myself and my team that we all have to operate at 120%. For me, this meant 80-hour work weeks and barely sleeping. I realize now that not only did I put my own health at risk, but also I was a bad role model for my team.
You would imagine that some of those phrases sounded familiar. All need to work at 120%. Not addressing your own needs. Gratitude to Mr. Mendoza for leading with that vulnerability. Another theme that he also made very clear in his story is how his personal choices about the way he worked may have affected other people on his team. So let's talk next about how changing the way that we work can be a powerful tool for mental health culture. First, a quote from Jennifer Moss. Picture a canary in a coal mine. They are healthy birds singing away as they make their way into the cave. But when they come out full of soot and disease, no longer singing, can you imagine us asking why the canaries made themselves sick? No, because the answer would be obvious. The coal mine is making the birds sick. Workplaces impact people's mental health. A traditional way of thinking would say that you can have work and you can have personal, and there could be a bright line between them. The pandemic has surely uncovered that that's not truly the case, especially when we're all videoing into work from our homes. But employees from the millennial and Gen Z generations have been saying this for years. Workplaces impact people's mental health. In addition, an employee's immediate manager is the person who impacts their mental health the most. So as leaders, we need to make sure we're training and empowering managers to change the way that they work. And as managers, we need to take our team culture and practices into consideration. So take a look at this list of the research-based workplace factors that impact mental health. Job strain, effort, reward, and balance, working really hard and no one's ever acknowledging it. Mission-driven work, we feel really committed to the work that we're doing. Job insecurity certainly has been relevant for a lot of folks in the last 12 months. Discrimination, there's been a magnifying glass on this one recently, but it is not new either. Low decision latitude, high psychological demands, not to mention high psychological demands coming from all areas, caregiving, family, being at home, work. Prolonged uncertainty, double circle star on this one for the last 12 months, and low social support. What have you done as a leader or a manager to eliminate the negative effects of these constants? It's not individuals taking it upon themselves to take care of yourself that's going to make a difference. It's specific, deliberate strategies that you can empower your people with. We could probably talk about this one for the next 3 days. So let me just highlight a few that are particularly important. The first is to model mentally healthy behavior. Again, if you're telling people to take care of themselves and you're not actually doing it, they're going to intuit that successful people don't need to take time for mental health, which is not true. In fact, we know from research that folks in the C-suite experience mental health challenges at the exact same rate as employees throughout the organization. But actually, during the pandemic, mental health has been worse for people at leadership levels. So certainly, it's just as important for leadership to take care of their own mental health. A few examples, and these should feel familiar and obvious. Holding time for no meeting days or hours to actually get work done. Actually signing off, not answering emails at 4 a.m. or 10 p.m. Actually taking PTO. Marking mentally healthy activities on your calendar. Maybe this is exercise. Maybe it's, again, not being responsive during this time period. Maybe it's an activity of a child. Maybe it's marking therapy on your calendar. This is, with permission, Ryan Benici, who's the Chief Marketing Officer, puts his therapy on his calendar. He writes, I've got 99 problems, but not making time to see my psychologist ain't one. So the people on his team not only know that mental health is a priority, but that it's okay to take care of it during the workday. The second piece is to question your practices. This is the hardest one, and honestly, the one that needs to happen the most. If the pandemic has uncovered flaws in our workplaces, this is certainly one of them. Workplaces are unsustainable. Again, people are working an extra 2 hours a day since the pandemic hit. For example, as a leader, can you always justify any urgency that you're creating? Is there a justification? Does it need to be done by a certain time? What's the urgency? What's the justification? Can you be clear about that? Are you questioning your practices, especially when it comes to client-facing work? The idea is not to take your culture or your work practices as given. Oh, we're this industry. Oh, we've always done it this way. Oh, people can handle it. Don't just tell people to take PTO. Adjust their work so they actually can take PTO. Don't just tell people to take care of themselves. Try shifting your development cycle back a couple of weeks. The CEO of Basecamp, as an example, when the pandemic hit, for those who had caregiving responsibilities, allowed them to set their hours, but not only set their hours, to set their hours even if that meant working fewer hours. And that's one of the biggest things. There's a lot of companies who've given people more flexibility on when they work, but they're working just the same or more. That's not actually shifting mental health as it could. The final one is talking about hard things. It's so easy in the corporate speak that we're all familiar with to talk about wellness and well-being. And those are great words. Also use the words mental health. Using the phrase mental health actually can make a difference in stigma in itself, which again, making a difference in stigma makes a difference in people feeling supported and not having to cover up what's going on with them and seeking support earlier, not waiting that 8 to 10 years. Also talking about the intersection of identity, race, equity, and mental health. Pinterest is a good example of this recently. So they have a couple of employee resource groups. One's the Blackboard group, one's the Pinside Out group, which is the mental health group. So at the beginning of Black History Month, the Blackboard ERG hosted a panel discussion specifically around mental health in the Black community. And then a few days later, the Mental Health ERG created a safe space to continue talking about those topics. Bringing it to the forefront, what's the intersection between mental health, identity, race, equity, and creating constant spaces for those conversations to happen. If you are uncomfortable about any of this, if you've said to yourself, I roll, this is not going to work in my industry, or aren't I just coddling people if I do this, or aren't people going to take advantage of me? This is not how my company or my industry works. I imagine then you might have the belief that supporting mental health and enabling high performance are in opposition. So if you're supporting mental health, performance is going to go down, better to ignore it, keep it where it was. The reality is the opposite. Supporting mental health increases performance. People who are supported in their mental health are more engaged, they're more able to use their experience to their benefit. And workplaces who do this are more inclusive, have higher levels of belonging. So 80% of individuals who have a diagnosed mental health condition can live completely symptom-free with the right treatment. This is why you don't want people waiting 8 years to seek treatment, because treatment works. In addition, companies that invest in programs like awareness, training, stigma reduction, see a 5-to-1 or a 6-to-1 ROI. Supporting mental health enables performance. Now, neither of these, well, we've talked about storytelling, workplace practices, can exist in a vacuum. So let's talk about what it means to be strategic about mental health. In our years of working with companies to create mentally healthy, high-performing cultures, here's what we found to be the recipe for success. First, equip leaders, managers, and employees with the right skills. Leaders need to understand what their role is. Managers need to know how to have one-on-one conversations to support employees in a way that balances compassion and compliance, know how to change the way that they work. Everyone needs to know that mental health is a thing, what stigma looks like, and how to find support for your own mental health. And beneath all that, there needs to be a solid foundation of expectations and daily practices that support mental health for teams. Second, systems need to support mental health. Your policies need to support mental health. For example, do people know that because mental health is health, sick days can be used for mental health? Do people know that they can take a therapy appointment during the day? Benefits also need to include mental health. And I said earlier, mental health is not a benefit. It's not. But benefits are part of mental health. If your only answer here is an EAP, it's not enough. Usage rates of EAP are abysmal. Mental health benefits need to meet people where they're at. With a stigmatized issue like mental health, there needs to be multiple levels where people can engage. Maybe it's clinical counseling, maybe it's coaching, maybe it's virtual visits or text coaching. Maybe it's just unallocated funds that folks can use to support their mental health. And finally, there needs to be accountability. Mental health goals need to be set and measured. Strategy, programs, practices around mental health also need to be inclusive of all communities and mental health experiences, because again, there's intersectionality between identity and mental health. And clear ownership of goals, including at the leadership level. Certainly, HR can play a really important role when it comes to mental health. It also needs to be owned by leadership because mental health is a culture issue. So let's look at a few specific examples of what this can look like. So in all these cases, the specific activities are not meant to be an exhaustive list of what each company is doing, but just highlighting a few things around their strategic approach that I think we can take things away from. So Morrison Foerster is a law firm affectionately known as MoFo. They embarked with the goal to raise awareness around mental health, but also create a supportive environment around it. So the first thing that they did was set up a steering committee comprised of senior leaders that represented across their global offices. And this group was in charge of making the programming decisions, setting goals, moving it forward in the long term. This wasn't a 2-month project. This is ongoing strategic work around mental health. Then they embarked on a company-wide assessment to understand things like attitudes towards mental health, prevalence of mental health challenges. Do people actually understand the benefits that we have? Do they know where to go to find support? Things like that. From that, then you can build programs, support, communication, messaging to make it all work. So for example, MoFo implemented ongoing training to support specific groups of people. So people who managed other people, general audience, things like that. The next example is that of BlackRock. So similarly, taking a strategic approach. So on the measurement side, they actually began using pulse surveys to understand stressors and to understand what staff wanted around mental health. I'm sure you probably already do an engagement survey. You probably already do some pulse surveys. Are you talking about mental health? Are you asking about what stigma looks like? Are you asking about people's access to resources? Really important part if you want to measure progress towards your mental health goals. In the people and training space, they created remote skill building for managers. Managers training is one of the most important things you can do around mental health. Managers, we talked about earlier, are where the rubber meets the road. A person's experience at work is influenced most by the manager that they work for, and that's especially true when it comes to mental health. Managers most of the time don't have any clue how to do this. Do they know how to respond if someone approaches them with a question about mental health or discloses a mental health condition? Do they know how to talk about mental health in a way that respects privacy, but that also feels human and natural? Do they know what tools are available to them for problem solving? There's a lot to do for mental health culture, for managers knowing what to do on their teams. And then coming back to BlackRock on the policy side, they created enhanced health and well-being support for their employees and also increased work flexibility and time off. Again, increased work flexibility is a really powerful tool. But if you're not also changing the way that you work and giving people space to do that, it's not sufficient. Final example is that of Verizon Media. The CEO of Verizon Media has been an excellent external voice for mental health, but this is also translated internally. So there's strong executive communications around mental health being a priority. And this doesn't just come from the C-suite, it comes from department heads, from group leads, consistent messaging around mental health being a priority. On the grassroots level, there's a neurodiversity-based employee resource group that convenes people for support, for learning, and moves it forward in that way. They also trained executives and managers. And again, a lot of the skills between those two groups are similar, and that executives are probably managers as well. But executives also have a different role around culture setting and communication. And so making sure that there's space to explore that, set goals, to be intentional. And then finally, an example, there was a storytelling video campaign that actually came from employees, but around people with mental health stories, sharing that around, and then the CEO backing that up with more executive communication around the priority of mental health. Because of the stigma around mental health, it takes a lot of communication from a lot of different people for people to truly believe you that mental health is a priority. I mentioned a couple of times employee resource groups or other sort of employee-led initiatives. I want to be sure that we give a spotlight on those because they can be a really important part of this sort of holistic strategy. So when I say employee-led initiatives, I mean one of two things. So employee resource groups. So probably most of us are familiar with employee resource groups. They're often community or identity-based. They can also be mental health-based. Sometimes they're mental health explicitly. Sometimes maybe it lives within an ability-based employee resource group or within a neurodiversity-based one. They look like all different sorts of things. But the idea is that they create a space for peer support and also potentially a space for allyship and advocacy. Peer champion programs are similar. Usually those are structured as a smaller group of volunteers that are trained specifically in empathic listening and allyship and can promote that throughout the organization. So a couple of examples on the ERG side. Best Buy does a great job of addressing the intersectionality of mental health and identity in community. So every month they have an event that's confidential, people can come to, and it's related to events of the day. So it's Black History Month, it's Veterans Day, it's Women's History Month. They talk about the intersectionality of mental health and that issue. Folks have a chance to share stories about it, hear from others, ask questions, and go deeper into that topic in a safe space. J&J has a program called Mental Health Diplomats that actually started through grassroots storytelling. Again, storytelling works and has grown to have really strong executive support and really become a force in the company for mental health culture change. On the peer champion programs, there's lots of companies doing this. I'm just pulling out some examples, but Genentech has a mental health champions program that's focused on being allies and advocacy. So people can, whatever their role is, be an advocate for mental health, and then as they're hearing things, they can also raise that up. So for the people that are in charge of mental health, or the people that are moving strategy forward, they're getting a voice from employees, from people on the grassroots level. Google has a program called Blue Dot, which was also started by a group of employees, and that's purely around peer listening. It's purely around people having someone that they can go to, or many people that they can go to for listening ear, to vent, to talk about hard things that doesn't feel as official. Earlier, I talked about when you think about your mental health benefits, meeting people where they're at. Peer champion programs are a great way to do that. People have a lot of hesitancy about going somewhere that seems formal or official to get support. And creating a peer program is a great way to meet people where they're at. And then certainly that can play a role in referring people up the ladder, for the support that makes most sense to them. So while these groups play a vital role in creating mentally healthy culture, they can't be the only thing. If the only thing your company is doing is mental health ERG, first of all, great work, awesome. But also it has to be part of a bigger strategy and it has to have sufficient support. So Mindshare Partners has a free community of mental health ERGs with 200 companies in it who have a mental health ERG, who are trying to start a mental health ERG. And we did a survey to see what kind of budgets people were given. The median amount was $0. And often ERGs are the main place or the first place employees go for mental health support. They need resources. I would challenge any company who has a mental health ERG, give that group $25,000 and see what they can do with it. It will be the best money that you spend. Groups also need senior leadership involved and advocating for them. Because mental health is stigmatized, their legal teams sometimes push back. Can't talk about mental health at work. This opens us up for liability. Leaders can push back and make sure that ERGs, the peer champion programs, are given the green lights and the permission they need to push these programs through. And the leaders of these groups finally need acknowledgement. Maybe that's extra pay. Maybe that's reduced responsibilities in their day job. Maybe it's at least acknowledgement, but supporting people who are leading those efforts. So as a recap, we need to do 3 things to unlock the potential of a mentally healthy culture. No more one-time mental health webinars. Rather, start the conversation by sharing your story. being vulnerable and talking about mental health by using the words mental health over and over and over. We need to back up our verbal permission of taking care of ourselves and actually change the way that we work and build that in throughout our system so that managers are also giving that permission to their teams. And finally, instead of just delegating the whole thing to HR, make it a leadership priority. Make it part of a broader mental health strategy that has ownership throughout the organization. Before I close out, I want to mention just a few free resources to go to if you want to start. So the mental health ERG community that I mentioned, it's free. If you have a mental health ERG, or you want to start one, please check that out. Also, a few things I mentioned today. So the strategy framework, which was up for not that many seconds, is available for download for free on our website, as well as the measurement questions. So if you want to think about incorporating mental health questions into your pulse surveys, into your engagement surveys, start there for the 5 questions that we most recommend. With that, thank you for your time. Culturati community, a pleasure to be here, and hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference.